Hello, everyone. Peter here. Welcome to City Lights, especially those of you online. Welcome. Before we get started, as always, just want to let you know we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. Always like to make reference to that at the beginning of each event and pay tribute to those who have come before us and who are still around as the original stewards of the land. So with that said, delighted to have Héctor Tobar with us tonight, again, this time in the flesh. The last time was actually online and was fabulous, but this time, just great to be here in the poetry room. So of course, we're celebrating this fantastic new book, Our Migrant Souls, a meditation on race and the meanings and myths of Latino. And it's published by our friends at MCD Press. And we go back a long ways with them. Sean McDonald, all the whole gang, love them. And, they just keep producing really, really amazing stuff. And so the fact that they picked up on this book, kudos to them. So this book assembles Mr. Tobar's personal experiences as the son of Guatemalan immigrants and meditates upon and decodes the meaning of the word Latino as a racial and ethnic identity in the modern United States. So he seeks to give voice to a younger generation of Latinx people who have seen their heritage demonized by propaganda, trolling, and so on, and aim to kind of disenfranchise and exploit them. Mr. Tobar explores a wide array of subjects, from the US-Mexico border wall to urban segregation, from gangs to queer Latino utopias to the emergence of the cartel genre in TV and film. So this is a vital, a very, very timely collection, and City Lights, of course, is very, very honored to be celebrating this book release. So Mr. Tobar is the author of the critically acclaimed New York Times bestseller Deep Down Dark, as well as The Barbarian Nurseries and Translation Nation and The Tattooed Soldier. We will be posting links for all of his books online. We also, for those of you here, have plenty of them over here, and we will have signed copies tonight, just to let you know. So those of you online, buy a book, you will get a signed copy. So just want to let you know, Mr. Tobar is also a Pulitzer Prize winner. He makes his home in Los Angeles, where he lives with his family. We're also very delighted to have John McMurtrie with us tonight. He's the senior editor at the literary journal Ziziva, and this is something that was a late-breaking development. We're really, really happy that he's on board with them, and I think he and Oscar Villalon are going to do a really amazing job with Ziziva. He's also edited for McSweeney's, also Stranger's Guide, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Lit Hub. From 2008 to 2019, he was the book editor at the San Francisco Chronicle. He's been really in a very, very vital part of the San Francisco literary scene for many years. So very delighted to have him as interlocutor. So everyone, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Héctor, for coming here, and everybody here and online. And I won't tease you too much about this, Peter. I remember maybe a handful of years ago, last time we were here, or I was here for the last book event, where there was a little bar over here. So I suppose that book had a little something to do with alcohol, which might have been the motivation. So perhaps maybe for your next book, if you throw in something, this guy will set everybody up, So yes, let's talk about this book, Our Migrant Souls, an impassioned, important book. And I want to start off with the design of it, which is lovely. And you'll notice here, Héctor, you're wearing the same image.
Yes, I'm wearing this
the pin.
Bird here on my pin. It's swag here. My publisher.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you might wonder, why is there a bird here? And you find out fairly early on in the book. Yes, I think perhaps the designer had another thought, but it hit me right away. Birds, plural, I think. Yes. And I was hoping you could talk about that, because I think it's a perfect metaphor for so much of what this book is about. And okay, so it's coming back to you now. Or just that specific.
I can riff off of anything.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
So tell us about the birds.
First of all, the design is by the great Rodrigo Corral, who's like this great Colombian American book designer. Wonderful, and designed the covers to most of my books, including the cover there of The Barbarian Nurseries and Deep Down Dark and The Last Great Road Bum. And just, he's the C in MCD. the publishing house.
Didn't know that.
Yes. And so Rodrigo designed that, and we went back and forth with a lot of designs. And I mean, to me, the bird is, the bird is a creature of nature who knows no borders, obviously, and birds migrate, right? As we do as human beings. I think that part of my discovery through the writing of this book was just how much migration is a human constant, right? That we as a species have been migrating for a couple of millennia.
Right.
And that if you look at the history of almost any ethnic or national group, there are stories of migration involved. So to me, that's a big part of it.
The moment I was thinking of is you're with a woman at the border, and
Yes.
and she's talking about the stupid border, I think,
Yes.
in those terms.
That's right. Yes. There's a woman at the border who she is undocumented, but she's a DACA recipient. So when you have DACA, you have kind of a parole in the eyes of the law where you can go cross the border, even though you're undocumented, you get a social security number. And she does this really bold thing, which is she goes to the border and she visits this border wall, and she takes undocumented immigrants to confront this scary thing, which is the fence, the border wall. And she says that I look at this fence, and it's this famous spot where the border fence goes into the ocean. And she says, to me, it's kind of comforting to just see this fence with the birds on top of it, because inevitably it's an ocean. And so there's birds on top of this fence. And to her, it's a way of demystifying this symbol. I mean, it's this wound in the United States. It's this wound in Latino people, the fact that there is this fence that separates us from our relatives.
Completely. And you get into the history of that as well. It seems, especially for younger people, as this ever-present thing, the wall. But it hasn't been there all that long, historically speaking. I mean, the whole stretch of it, right?
Well, yeah, I'm a history geek, and that will be evident to anybody who reads this book. But I as a columnist for the LA Times, I once wrote a column about the history of the border fence. And the fence, of course, hasn't always been there. I mean, it had to be drawn, and there's a wonderful book, La Gran Línea, by an academic, by a geographer, about the drawing of the line. And essentially, these two groups of surveyors, Mexican and American, have to sort of decide in this arbitrary point, where is the border going to begin? And it's become, just in the 60s and 70s, really what it is, in the 80s, especially in 90s, it became what we know today. But before that, I mean, there's an image of Pat Nixon visiting the border and shaking hands through a few strands of barbed wire, where there's now this huge steel wall, right, of a barrier.
Another moment where we find ourselves longing for the good days of the
Nixon
administration.
Right, exactly. Yeah, well, he passed food stamps, among other things. But yes.
So much of this book is an examination of the way things are. Why is there a border between the U.S. and Mexico? Why, as you write, are ethnicity and race sold to us as boxes containing our skin tones and our surnames? And why do we have terms like Latino? So I'm hoping you can explain the origin of that term, Latino, which you use in quote marks a lot in the book and on the title.
Well, yeah, I think
on the cover.
Yeah, all of these terms which we live with, right? White, Latino, Black, Asian, are all representations of stories that we tell about why we're different peoples. And most of them have their roots in bringing people to work and people to do work that other people don't want to do. So that's the invention of white and Black, is to justify slavery. And so the idea of Latino people being this different race of people, because even though we are an ethnicity, we're treated like a race, right? The rhetoric in the media is a racist rhetoric. That idea is something you can trace the origin of in the United States. You could see how that term has evolved. You can see there was a time when people thought of Latinos as the next sort of ethnic group that would assimilate, like the Italians and the Jews and the Germans. And then you have the big migration flows of the last part of the 20th century and the building of these barriers and the construction of this idea of Latino people as this dangerous, barbarous mass of people on the other side of the border, right? But the term itself, Latino, has a very strange provenance. You know, I say in my book that it's like the terms in Star Wars, Wookiee and all these other made up sort of tribe names. It's kind of the same thing, you know, because Latino comes from Latin America. Okay. So Latin America itself is an invention essentially of the French in the 19th century, because the French wanted to take over Mexico and they told the Mexicans, look, we're different than those Anglo-Americans because they don't speak a Romance language. We are closer. We're Latins like you. And so we're setting over this guy, you know, Maximilian to be your king, but he's really one of you.
That went well.
You know, and of course later they executed him. But and so that idea of Latin America, that we have this commonality as people of Spanish descent with the French, right, is an invention of this, you know, imperialist competition. Later, Latino people in the United States, you know, we're given this term Hispanic because we have this Spanish origin, right? Well, that term evolved, you know, people don't like it because it sounds English, Hispanic. So people use Latino because it comes from Latin America. But one of my many problems with all of these terms is that they're silly, but specifically Latino, it erases the fact that we're also indigenous and Black, right? So Latin is by definition this European term. And so, and this is what has happened to Latino identity to all of us, is that we have these family stories in which we've erased our indigenous history. We've erased our indigeneity. My family, my grandparents, two of the grandparents I could interview when I was in my 20s, I asked them, what are we? You're dark brown, grandfather. You know, you're from Tecpan, Guatemala. You know, it's what are we Canjobal? No, absolutely not. We're Spaniards. You know, it's like what, you know, and so and in Guatemala and many places, Peru and Mexico, there's a long history of you know, okay, we can choose two surnames. Let's go with Garcia instead of, you know, Shungash or some other indigenous name, which happens to this day in Guatemala. People choose to have a Spanish surname when they can, very often they do, right? Only recently as there's indigenous pride. So the term Latino hides all of that. At the same time, it's an expression of a kind of an alliance. So for example, I have a friend who's Colombiana. I am Guatemalan. I know a Puerto Rican guy. We have a dinner together for an event we're holding. It's a Latino event, right? Instead of being a Colombian, Guatemalan, Puerto Rican event, because we do have a lot in common, right? We have in common, you know, the fact that we have ancestors who crossed the border or who crossed the ocean. So these terms, you know, they have all kinds of hidden sort of meanings and stories behind them.
Sure. And even Spanish, I think.
Yes. Well, people in New Mexico call themselves that. They call themselves Spanish because many of them are descended.
But how about going back centuries, the term
right.
Spanish?
And the term, right. And even to be Spanish, well, to be Spanish also might mean that you're concealing a Jewish identity, right?
And that was a construction in opposition.
Yes, in itself. Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yes. When the Spanish came during the conquest, these assembled conquistadores and settlers, they didn't call themselves Spanish. They called themselves Gallegos or Castilians or, you know, Andaluces or whatever. And they became Spanish in reference to the Indians. So you're Gallego and I'm Basque, but we're both Spanish because they're Indians, which is the same thing that happens with white and Black, by the way. But that's another story.
So your parents are from Guatemala, but you grew up in Los Angeles, in East Hollywood specifically. And there's one piece in this book that's quite moving and really powerful, and not just because one figure shows up enough to give you chills for
Yes.
people of a certain age. I remember, I think I was a kid when he broke out of prison.
Oh, wow.
So, and got caught eventually, right? So tell us about your neighbor when you were a kid, just for a little bit. You didn't know him, but that's pretty freaky to have him, right?
Yeah, I mean, the whole chapter, which began in an article for the New Yorker, was the idea was I wanted to write about how I lost my innocence about race, right? Because I grew up in a very sheltered, very protected family. My family protected me from the idea that I was different, right? And I thought about the place where I grew up, East Hollywood, California, place very racially integrated, like a lot of neighborhoods in San Francisco, other cities, right? And I thought about its history, and I realized, because I read history obsessively, that I lived 100 feet from James Earl Ray, the man who assassinated Martin Luther King. And I thought about how this neighborhood had harbored this white supremacist who committed this horrific crime. And so I write about James Earl Ray. I talk about his life. He was somebody escaping from poverty, like my father was, actually. Had a lot in common with my father, who at the same time was a very progressive person, my father was a leftist at that time, very much a fan of Che Guevara. So they were opposite sides politically, but they were people running away. And there's another character in that chapter, Booker Wade, my godfather, also a runaway African-American man, had participated in sit-ins at the Memphis Public Library against segregation in the public library. He ran away from Memphis. He was busted at the library, harassed by the police. His mother put him on a bus to LA as a teenager. He comes to LA. He becomes friends with my mother, and he becomes my godfather because he drove my mother to the hospital when she went into labor with me.
He had volunteered to do so.
He had volunteered to do so. So my life at a really young age crossed paths with this virulent white supremacist and this African-American activist. And I say, it might seem strange to you, the reader, that my life has these, crosses paths with these two very different people, but that's America. The United States, we're always placed inside the middle of this drama. And really all it takes is a little bit of investigating to find out how our life crosses paths with American history.
Sure. It's a microcosm
Yes.
of America in a lot of ways. My place that I often think about along those lines is Whittier, California.
Oh, I went to high school in Whittier.
Okay. I
Yes.
didn't know that. Within LA County, I don't know why I remember this, that Nixon,
Yes.
back to
Whittier
Nixon.
College.
See,
Yes.
I'm scarred. That he's from there. But
Right.
then one of my favorite baseball players, I'm from Boston.
Nomar Garcia.
So
Parra.
Nomar, yeah.
Yes, he's from
He's
Whittier
from
also.
there. So Whittier has changed a little bit, I think. And not
It's
so
now
many.
called the Latino Beverly Hills.
So there you go. Yeah. Not too many Quakers.
Not too many Quakers left now.
So I want the Whittier history. So you got to write this first person thing. You were there. So any number of places, right?
Oh yeah,
California,
no, I
but
mean,
sort of
Los
transformed.
Angeles is an amazing place and so much movement. Or like this neighborhood, right, that we're in right now with its Italian roots and all the different kinds of peoples in Chinatown right next door, which is not an uncommon thing. It's in Los Angeles. The old Chinatown is right next to the old Italian neighborhood also. So yeah.
I think I have a long question here. See if it makes any sense. But as you write, this country has experienced waves of discrimination,
Right.
Against any number of different people. The Irish need not apply, and of course African Americans and Latinos. And the hope is that white people over time will be perhaps more welcoming of people who aren't like them. But of course, the distressing reality is that there always seems to be another group to attack, whether it's Asian Americans or gay
Right.
people, or as we've seen lately, gender nonconforming people. So it's really this, it seems to be an intractable problem. And I'm wondering if you see it that way, and where there might be hope in that. I mean, it's a constant fight, a struggle, I suppose.
Well, I started writing my book because I'm a professor at the University of California, Irvine, which part of that is like being this wise sort of imparter of knowledge, but also part of it is like being a dad, because there's all these 20-year-olds who kind of come through, and they have all this longing. They want to read, and they want to be powerful. They want to have, they want to have all the books sort of seep into their brain and become strong. And they live in this world with all this hatred. And, they tell these stories about the ways in which their parents and their families have been belittled as Latino people. or the ways where they've been traumatized by crossing the border or by separation from family or their status. And so I really wanted to give them a book that said, look, it's right for you to be hurt. It's okay for you to be hurt, right? These are the reasons why we're in this situation. And there's nothing wrong with us, because there's a real sense among Latino people that there's something broken about us. It's a kind of thing that comes up again and again. It's like, no, this is just the way of the world. And so the book lays out all of this history, sort of show our story in terms of the Chinese migration, and the Chinese Exclusion Act and Dred Scott and slavery and the construction of Black as a racial identity. So our story fits inside that story. And to me, it's a lot less overwhelming when I see it as part of this landscape. But the part of it too is that the more I looked at this, I realized that, the construction of race is this constant in American history. And by race, I mean the notion that because of our color of our skin, or that we belong to that race is this biological group that we belong to, and that because of that, we have common traits. So because I'm indigenous Latino, I'm not smart. I don't want to work hard, or maybe I want to work really hard for a little money, all the stereotypes. So that's what race is. Race is this notion that there's a group of people who share common biological traits, and that shapes who they are. Now, science has now shown that that's bullshit, right? That the DNA of people who are, all white is more different than the DNA of Black people. I mean, in other words, that the differences within a group are bigger than the differences between groups. So to me, what's interesting and what I see is the way we always are constructing new ideas of race. And so when I end the book, I talk about how you can imagine that a future where if I could suddenly, snap my finger or give everybody a pill or set off a ray that erased all of the racist ideas from our minds, that have been inculcated in us. Even if we did that, we would invent new ideas of race to explain why there are poor people and rich people, why there are people living in apartments and why there are people living on the streets. And I see that happening with the unhoused or the homeless, right? Where people start to invent this notion of the way they are, right? So to me, that's the journey that I've undertaken myself with this book intellectually, is to arrive at this understanding of race as essentially part of this capitalist system. Excuse me, I'm in San Francisco, so I can say that. That really constantly is inventing new terms to divide us, right?
And along Marxist lines, there have been any number of books in recent years that talk about democracy, how it, quote unquote, democracy, how something like it can't exist unless other people are suffering.
Yes.
So there's this one line in your book that I think perfectly encapsulates the uglier side of democracy that many of us don't see or choose to ignore. And you write, quote, "Ethnic hatreds and race engineering are the dark force that created the modern world." That's it right there. If you want to elaborate a little bit on that.
I've had this fascination with my whole life. My whole life. When I was a kid, when I was an adolescent, I just was fascinated with the Holocaust, and Rwanda. I just fascinated with what happened in Rwanda, and what is going on here. And you come to realize that that this thing that's happening to our people, because there are people dying in huge numbers right now in the desert, right? You hear every few months you hear of a new mass death of migrants crossing the border. And it's just you come to realize that it's not that there's a moral equivalency between the deaths on the border and the Holocaust. It's that they're all, or slavery or what, it's that they're all part of the same story. It's a continuum of a story of constructing our modern world, of constructing this abundance that we have, in the United States, our comfort, right? Our comfort is based on these systems of inequality. And it sounds rhetorical. It sounds like I'm standing in a soapbox. It just happens to be true. I mean, the coffee that we drink, the labor that's required to bring the water to our tables, to keep to mine the coal that keeps the lights running, all of those things are they're all constructed from human labor. And there are some people who there are the people who do the work and the people who benefit from it. And that's just a constant, I think, in human history and in our present. And so, for example, oh my God, I've been done a couple of media interviews in the last few weeks. And so, they have all these images on the border right now, right? All the masses of people at the border. And the few times I've turned on CNN, and heaven forbid Fox News, you see these, these groups of people is usually, and they do this wide shot, with these drones, and they show hundreds of people in front of the border. And it's like this image of this chaos, and they tell these stories. This they're going to run across the river, or there's not enough shelters for them. And it's this chaotic thing. And so for this month, this spring, that's the dominant image of Latino people in the media. And of course, that's a tragedy. Yes. And we should know about it. We should know that's happening. But to me, the dominant image of Latino people is when I go to a suburban neighborhood and I drive through and all the lawns are perfectly cut and all the shrubs are perfectly cut. And there's a lady walking, a little boy in a stroller, it's and when I see people coming home with their groceries, which were picked 90% of the food is picked by, Latino workers, and half of them are undocumented. That's the image to me of Latino people.
Well, your novel right over here, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. The Barbarian Nurseries. So to me, that's, it's frustrating. It's frustrating to live in this, in this media orbit where we're just being fed these one-dimensional, stark ideas of who a people are.
Though you do write about the border, and you include details, specifically this one academic I wasn't familiar with, or an anthropologist, Jason De Leon.
Yes,
and the work
MacArthur winner. Yes.
Yeah, understandably. Wow, that was.
Yeah, so Jason De Leon is this anthropologist who was trying to answer the question, how many people are really dying crossing the desert? Because there are these statistics, and there are some bodies that are found every year especially in the Sonoran Desert, Arizona, New Mexico. How many people are really dying? And there are bodies found, but so he went to go see what happens to a body when someone dies in the desert. So he took these corpses of pigs, put them out in the desert, and examined what happened to them. And hidden cameras and everything, and first are the feral dogs and the wolves and the vultures. And within about a few weeks, most of the body is erased.
And beetles.
And then finally beetles. There's this whole sort of natural cycle of what happens to a corpse, right? In the desert. And essentially he discovered that these bodies, that nature was doing the dirty work of American immigration policy, because nature is erasing the bodies. And I wrote in my piece that this is the perfect crime. It's like the perfect, I'm sorry, why am I laughing? It's the perfect sort of mass murder, because it's taking place where there's no cameras and the bodies are erased. And yet people get the message that people are dying.
Right. You equate it to the death penalty, that just as a warning.
Right.
This is what happens.
Yes. Yes. And it's horrific, but as I say, it's part of this continuum of the use of violence to intimidate people, because essentially they've subcontracted with the cartels to scare the shit out of people to keep them from coming. And so and not only that, as Jason De Leon writes about, you can find policy documents in which they anticipate that's going to happen. And in which, the Department of Homeland Security says, if this fence building thing works, more people are going to die. And that's how we'll be able to tell how it works, that it's working, is that more people die. So that's, yeah, that
Full
was
awareness. So what sort of work is he up to now?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Hmm.
He's at UCLA. I know that. And he won a MacArthur's,
Right.
probably doing something very important.
Switching gears a little bit, you attended UC Santa Cruz, right?
I did, yes.
And then you, shortly after or right after, you came up here to San
I did.
Francisco.
I
And
did.
you worked at a community newspaper that I don't know if it exists anymore.
It does. El
Okay.
Tecolote. I was the editor of El Tecolote newspaper in the Mission District.
All right.
Yes.
So, tell us about so were you writing in college, or how'd you get that bug? And so did it start college, or were
I always loved to write. You know, I read in the book that I didn't know this until I had written my fourth book, but my father, his mother was illiterate. She never learned how to read and write. So my father had this shame, and this is so common in Latino families. Female illiteracy is really high in the Latino community, because women very often, as girls, it's not seen as important in really poor families to send them to school, right? So my father, this happened. His mother couldn't read and write, and he never told me until I published my fourth book. But always loved coming to bookstores, loved reading. And my first really expensive present that I got was the brand new first edition American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language. And it was like, I realized that my father, who had a mother who could not read any word in any language, had given me, his son, all the words in English. So, you know, I always had this respect for the book, but I didn't know that you could be a writer. You know, I didn't know that was a job. And it was only until I moved after college to San Francisco and I started coming to events here and at Modern Times in the Mission District and all these other, that I met writers for the first time at an event like this. And I remember the first time that I ever met a published writer. It was Ariel Dorfman, the Chilean critic and, you know, and playwright. Oh my God, he was so cool. And then I met Sandra Cisneros at another event, you know, and I was like, wow, maybe I could do this. So this bookstore, and it makes me want to cry thinking about it, you know, was like my introduction to like literary culture. And now, you know, I mean, my books are there, but also they're downstairs in the fiction section. You know, there's like my 3 books are there, not too far from Tobar, you know. So, you know, that was my introduction to the culture of the word. And I became an editor of a community newspaper by accident. You know, I wanted to be a professional revolutionary. You know, that was my idea, but there were, you know, it was not really a very, you know, not a great, you know, profession in terms of.
You're going to be the media guy,
I was going to be the pen, like Trotsky,
okay.
the pen.
Okay.
And what happened was I was in the Mission District and I wandered into a panaderia, a bread store, Mexican bread store, and they had a stack of these free newspapers, El Tecolote, and I picked one up and I started reading it, and it said, we need volunteer writers and editors. And so I went to go volunteer. And then within 6 or 7 months of me always being there, they said, Hector, you're always here. You know, we just got a grant from the San Francisco Foundation. We can pay you $9 an hour to be the editor. I said, sure. And that was my first ever paid writing gig. And so, yeah, so I always equate this bookstore and San Francisco literary culture with the beginnings of my literary awakening. Yeah.
And you share this, and good thing this is being recorded so that can be used for posterity. You share this anecdote, I hope, with your students. I'm curious as to, and for any of you, young or older, what advice you might have for people who want to become writers. Often it's just that. I mean, it can be some stroke of luck, right?
Yeah, I think, and this is part of the message. It's part of the message of the book. I don't speak about specifically about writing, is that I think that we don't realize the profundity and the epic nature of our own stories. You know, because a lot of my students, people in their 20s, they haven't really read a lot of great literature about the Latino experience. Those books are out there. And when I give them books, I mean, they're really excited about them, but they don't think of, they think of themselves as people that are not of consequence, you know? And so part of it is me asking them to write stories for me. I tell them, write me a story about the Latino experience. That's it. That's the only, that's the parameter, right? and have it be true. I want it to be true. And so I get back and that's sort of what spurred the book, is like, I got all these stories of like border crossings, or fathers who were alcoholics and then born again, or fathers who were gardeners and just built a whole empire of tree trimming or whatever, and it was like, my God, these incredible stories. And so to me, the most important thing is to realize how profoundly awesome those stories are, which I think a lot of our young people don't get that message because they're not on the media. It's like there's not a great streaming series in Netflix, that's just about like a Grapes of Wrath about Latino farm. There isn't,
or where Latinos, you bring up Breaking Bad, where
right, that's what you see.
Yes,
Narcos on Netflix, which are fantastic shows. They're great works of art. Breaking Bad, I watched the whole series 3 times, really, and I also enjoy taking it apart in my book. Yes, you have the cartel movie is the dominant representation of Latino people in the American media, right? It's what Latino actors, especially Latino male actors, get the most work. Someone told me, one of my students told me that there's a guy, an actor, who's played like he always is given the same name, and he's always Hector, because Hector is like this Latino sounding name, Hector Salamanca, that is kind of odd, but it is, whatever. And so, yeah. And so, but it really is I think that when you look at these things, if you have compassion for the people telling the lies, you realize what the lies are really about. And let me explain what I mean by that. So cartel movies are essentially movies about white people who feel the world is against them. So what they do is they take the cartel and they make it a substitute for the corporation. So your average white guy, whatever, in quotes, because that term itself is completely whatever. Okay. Your average, Walter White is the protagonist of Breaking Bad. So you go to work for a company, you have a boss who treats you like shit, right? Who tells you, I own you, in effect, not using those words. And in the movie, that capitalistic force is the cartel. So the guys in the cartel, they're basically just your corporate executive making life miserable for everybody. I own your ass is what they say in the cartel movies. And so these movies are really, and these television shows are really about a white sense of powerlessness. And they've created a bad guy, which is us, right? They made us into this bad guy. And the other thing it does is it takes something very normal, like horror movies, like a horror movie. A horror movie takes something that's really normal and everyday, and it makes it into something scary. So, for example, in the movie Peppermint with Jennifer Garner, I'll never forgive her for this because I had to sit through that movie. I hated it. The cartel operatives their undercover operation where they work is a piñata factory. Because everybody now, piñatas, I believe, are pretty universal. Not just Latino families use piñatas, right, in their birthday celebrations. And so these cartel movies take this ordinary thing, which is the Latino guy next door. Everybody knows, like, a Latino person, you work with one, he's your father-in-law or whatever, and it transforms him into the possible, oh my God, he's really murderer, right? And so, to me, it's really, it was really a lot of fun to take that apart. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Back to your parents, they showered you with books too.
They did.
So
they did. Yes.
That made a difference. And
yes.
Did you have a chance to thank them for, your collection here?
Well, it's funny because I've written columns for the LA Times. I used to write a column. I used to write for the LA Times a lot. And my father would also often appear in my in my columns and in my newspaper stories. And when I most recently went to Guatemala, my mother said, "You're always writing about your father." Why don't you write about me? And so now when you open up the book and you look at the cover page, that's my mother holding me in 1963, when I was a newborn baby at Griffith Park. But, my parents also, now I sort of talk about, that they were
personal stuff.
Yeah, personal stuff. They were very liberated people. I mean, there were people raised in these Roman Catholic society, Guatemala, with all these strictures. And suddenly they're like two really good looking people in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s,
Things a lot going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, and I met their lovers, they were coming through all the time, for many years of my childhood. It was like, this is Joe and this is Dave. And this is like, this is Linda, my step parents. So yeah, it was fun to write about. It was fun to try to be honest without completely, breaking my ties to my parents. So one of the things I did I put it off forever and ever. I finally, when the book came out in hardcover, when it came out, I went to my father's house and I read him the passages that were most problematic. And I told him, look, Papa, this is really about how handsome you were. And I haven't heard back, but I know but when I did, yeah, he's very happy though with the book. Yeah.
Not just for that reason. Before I forget, I should also mention that you should, as subscribers to the New York Times, read a piece that I think just went online today that Hector wrote about literary Los Angeles. It's part of this series you might have seen about other cities. So you write about some of the, well, Bukowski's in there, but not at length, thankfully, I have to say. I know City Lights. Yeah, it was cool to see. And that's so again, you're still doing your journalism in addition to nonfiction and novels. And
the New York Times asked me to write a journey through literary LA, like boil down all of Los Angeles literature to like 1,500 words. And so it was a great challenge, and I wrote it up, and it was wonderful to be asked. I think most writers we're just so grateful for those little affirmations, like being invited to City Lights and having people actually show up. It's like, oh, thank God. Thank you all for being here. And also being asked by the New York Times to write this literary guide. I was just so deeply honored. So I gave it my all. And it really is about, you get to a certain age where you just can summarize all the stuff that you read. So it was a summary of a lifetime of reading about Los Angeles, which is also what this book is about. It's really, it's about a lifetime of reading about the United States, reading about Latino people, and trying to make sense of the time that we're living in.
Yeah, so you should read that as well. And all you kind people, I'm sure you have questions for Hector. And I know, especially those who've just arrived, we hear those creaky stairs. Yes, not pointing fingers at anyone. Shall we talk about what you're writing now beyond pieces for the New York Times?
I think part of it, and part of the nice thing about being here is, I think that as a writer, you're always looking for reasons to be insecure. And so I've always felt like, oh, I'm a fiction writer, I'm a novelist, and people don't know that. So I'm writing a novel. I got a Guggenheim to write,
Did see that. Congratulations.
Yes, to write a series of novellas about Los Angeles and its history. Yes.
Fantastic.
So they begin 500 years in the future, and they go backwards all the way to the founding of the city in the 18th century and whatnot. Yeah.
Wow.
So I'm having a lot of fun doing that. That's what I'm working on.
That will keep you busy.
Yeah. And trying to make enough money to keep, paying my kids' tuition, college tuition.
So there you have 3 kids.
Yes. Home stretch.
Are they all in college now?
They've all either graduated or in college.
Okay,
yes.
Okay. And since we're in the poetry room, I think this is the one room where you don't have, or do you have any? No poetry.
No, I don't have any. I've never written any poetry. No.
Something you're not a triple threat.
I have written some poems. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I also wrote a play once, but that's another story.
Okay.
Yeah. A little bit of everything.
Questions, people.
Oh, yes.
Yes, please.
what is there to be said about how that helps create our worldview? And if not so much DNA that creates a propensity towards behavior, but maybe the fact that awkward doesn't exist as a direct against its family. Right. We have worldview more so than any genealogy or DNA.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that for me, Latino or Mexican or Guatemalan or whatever term that you prefer, right? Blaxican is a new one that I hear a lot in LA. Those terms refer to our history, right? They refer to the traditions. It refers to the things that make us feel grounded and centered as human beings, right? Starting with family. And so absolutely, language, if we're lucky enough to preserve our Spanish, and a lot of us are self-conscious about it. I think almost every Latino person, I think 90% of the Latino people in the United States are self-conscious about their Spanish. Even the people who speak fluently, when they go back home, it's like, oh, you're speaking a little bit different now, aren't you? That kind of thing. But yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a worldview that comes from this migrant experience that goes back to the villages that almost all of us have in our past. And I think that's also true of just American people, that if you go back, it takes longer for some of us, but you eventually will reach a village. Might be a village in Ireland. It might be a village in Poland, or it might be a village in Korea, but eventually there's a village back there. And so the rhythms of that life, especially the domestic labor, to me, that's a big part of my current fiction project, is understanding and celebrating and capturing the profound art and meaning to be found in the domestic spaces that usually our mothers construct, and so for my kids who are, Guatemalan, Mexican, Angelinos, Americans, for them, the food is like the thing that brings them, that's the front door to Latinidad. It's the fact that we eat pinto beans in our home, or that we make tamales, but when you sit down to make tamales in our family, when they sit down with their grandmother, they're sitting down and, they're getting the leaf and they're getting the masa. Okay, now the masa, they buy it at King Taco. They don't make it from scratch, but they're still putting together the whole thing. And so these rituals are they connect you. So absolutely, I think that there are many, many things that not only define us, but also are the source of our resilience in the face of racism and exploitation and uprootedness and everything. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Peter, I think you said there's a question online.
Yeah. So Audrey asks, Julio Cortázar in his lectures at UC Berkeley said there was no difference between fiction and nonfiction. As a journalist and writer of fiction, do you agree or disagree?
I would have to largely agree. There really is only one difference between nonfiction and fiction, and that's with nonfiction, you make a pact with the reader that you're not lying, that you're telling the truth, that you are, that if the guy's name is Pedro in your story, it really was Pedro or whatever, or that whatever, that these events really happened. So that to me is what gives nonfiction its authority. And also you can mix the two things up. You could have a largely nonfiction narrative that has elements of fiction in it. But when you do that, it becomes fiction because it's like being a little bit pregnant. Once you have a little bit of fiction in your story, it's basically fiction. So that to me, but other than that, yes, it's about character. It's about, above all, it's about the people at the center of your narrative. It's about setting, the places that you're bringing your reader into. It's about voice. Voice is such a powerful thing in both fiction and nonfiction. The attitude of the writer, all the poets and all of the literary traditions in their head, et cetera, et cetera. No, I do find them to be very, very similar. When I wrote my book on the Chilean miners, Deep Down Dark, it felt like a novel to me. The only difference was that it was a novel where all the characters are going to be reading about themselves later. So if I made anything up, then if I made anything up, then I would be in deep trouble with these 33 Chilean minors, which would be kind of a problem. So yeah, so that's basically the only difference. Yes.
About terms, Chicano, your wife,
Yes, Chicana. My wife is Chicana. Yes.
she uses that term, and
Yes.
you read a little in the book about how, there was a time for the term, right? Its popularity has since waned
Somewhat,
since
yeah.
the 60s
A lot,
and
actually,
70s.
yeah.
So, is there any chance of a resurgence, or what does she see in it?
No, I think that, these are terms, every term is born of a certain moment, right? So to me, Latino, the way we use it now, is born in the 1980s from these different migrations, Colombians, Mexicans, also not just Mexican migration in Chicago, but also Colombians and Puerto Ricans or wherever, right? These different American cities. So Chicano is a term born of the late 1960s and 1970s. And it's a term born of a new attitude. And the attitude is, we don't want to assimilate anymore. We don't even want to put a hyphen in terms of our name. We don't want to be Mexican Americans. We're Chicano. So it takes a term, Chicano, which used to be derogatory, and it turns it into something, a statement of purpose. Of course, the same thing has happened with queer, right? Queer is a derogatory term, which has now been embraced. I have a queer daughter, is a symbol of assertiveness. So that's what Chicano is. Chicano is this expression of an assertiveness and of a moment in time that was so beautiful, also kind of male-centered, the movement, but that's another story, right? But this really beautiful moment of assertiveness in the face of, a century of assimilation. The problem with Chicano, and I grew up with a lot of Chicano people, is that it's, specifically Mexican American. And so I could not call myself a Chicano. So that kind of felt like, I was kind of an outsider. So to me, that's part of why it's kind of faded a little bit. Then we had Latinx, which I don't know if it's fading now or if it's still sort of, that's kind of gone through this. Now people are trying to introduce Latine or Latin, which doesn't quite feel like it's getting a lot of momentum, That's why I put the word Latino in quotes in my book, because it was kind of like a defense. It's like, no, I don't really embrace this term completely, but
or
yeah.
Questioning of it.
Questioning it, exactly, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Do we have other questions? Please, sir.
I mean, in your talk,
Yes,
quotes, but you
all the time, yes. I do, and I do. Yes, we need terms. And like I said, Latino is a term that expresses a shared experience, right? It's saying like, I know I'm in a room with a lot of people who appear to be of Latin American descent, but I don't know specifically if they're Salvadoran or Colombian or Argentine or Mexican or what, or Chicano. And I'm going to use that term as a way of, of drawing us together. It's like an invitation to enter into a more intimate space, a conversation. Absolutely. I think that those terms have great value in that sense. It's just the opposite of that is reading a story about the Latino vote, in which it's like, why are Latinos voting for Trump? And it's like, well, hold on a second. That's like true of like 4 counties in Texas and 2 in Florida. But you know what I'm saying? And so that's frustrating. It's like, and I can't tell how many times it's like somebody who's really a progressive person has a little bit too much to drink. And they come up to me, he's like, Hector, what's going on with the Latino voters, man? It's like, ay, otra vez, So that to me is, so absolutely. They definitely have use. Yeah.
Any more questions? Please.
Oh, all the time. Right. How often does one use? A lot. It's really wonderful. To me, I'm a native English speaker. I mean, Spanish was my first language, but then I lost my language, that language, as English crowded it out. So I had to go back to college to learn Spanish. I picked it up again in college, and then I lived in Latin America. And the use of the first person plural feminine, nosotras, that's a really powerful thing, or Latinas, because it's referring to a group of women. And that is a really powerful thing. Absolutely. The Spanish language, a lot of people like to beat it up because it has gender as part of, it just has built into the language. But it also is really cool that there are these spaces that women can use in the language to express something that isn't quite translated quite so easily into English. Absolutely.
It's beautiful.
Yes.
English does
Yes.
not have that.
English doesn't have that. Yes.
Another little thing English does not have is you'll read a long sentence, right? You realize at the very end it's a question.
Yeah.
Why can't we introduce the Spanish style upside down question mark before, right at the beginning of the
exactly.
sentence?
Yes, exactly.
It would help. Also, 6 years of mandatory Spanish for Californians. Maybe we could do that. I don't know.
Well, it's funny because if you go to Europe, multilingualism is a symbol of like achievement, right? So you meet your average Dutch person, they speak like 4 or 5 languages, right? But in the United States, speaking more than one language is a sign usually of working class status, right? You speak Korean because you are a Korean immigrant, right? And so, but yeah, I mean, and in California passed measures against teaching Spanish in its schools at one point. But yeah, I absolutely agree. I think speaking more than one language, I speak like 2.5, a little bit of Portuguese, is just a fantastic thing. And yeah.
Place to start. You're introduced to the history of places, to the literature.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, Hector, thank you so much. I think we have books here.
Yes, I will sign any book that anybody wants to buy or take, or I'm sorry. So thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You too.